Welcome to Politica, a new podcast from the Jewish Independent that explains Israeli politics at a diaspora volume. I'm Sharon Offenberger here in Australia, and joining me from Israel is my co-host Yuval Regev. Yuval and I began recording this podcast over the past weeks, and we were getting ready to launch, but instead a war in Iran launched. It was impossible to stick to the original orderly plan, and so here we are starting our new podcast with a special edition. Just as we were about to start, Yuval had to go down to the shelter because there were sirens all over Israel, so that may happen while we're recording. But here we are recording this episode, War, What Is It Good For?, during week 2 of the Iran war. The second Iran war. The 12-day war with Iran last year, which was called Operation Rising Lion, was heralded as historic and a game changer. And yet here we are, again, 9 months later with a new offensive. This war has begun with some pretty impressive military actions, including the fact that this is a full joint operation with the USA and the upending of a regime that has been in place for 47 years. The regime is upended but not overturned. The joy on the streets of Western capitals, including in Australia, with Iranians and Jews dancing together, have been remarkable, given the enmity of the two countries. As my colleague at the Jewish Independent wrote recently, Iranian diaspora protests are the only place left in the West where the Israeli flag is welcome. But impressive military tactics themselves are often short-term achievements, and things are never straightforward in the Middle East. So, assuming we don't get disturbed by another siren and missile launch, either from the east or from the north, let's talk about the pros and cons of this war. And because this is Politica, where this fits into Israeli politics. Yuval, shalom.
Shalom, shalom. So yeah, quite a start we had for this recording. And I think before we dive into the issues, I want to bring you into the atmosphere. And the atmosphere is quite special. It's very different from the first round. And it's also very different from, of course, from when this entire war broke out on October 7th. And there's a term that I want to explain to you that we use here in Israel. It's a bit graphic, so I apologize in advance. But the words that we use to describe the national atmosphere here is zikpa leumit, which literally translates into national erection, or you could also maybe say nationalist erection, depending on how you associate and affiliate. And it's a graphic description, but it very much correlates with this feeling of, we're all very hot for the war effort, and we're all very supportive, and we're all, rooting for our country and rooting for our soldiers. And there's this, feeling of national pride. And I'll bring you into, the first few days, right? This war broke out right before Purim. And Purim is the Jewish festival where we all celebrate how we overcame another Persian dictator who was set out to annihilate us and to kill us all. And so we all get into our costumes. And on Purim, what we saw across Israel, and I'll give you my personal experience, is that Israelis chose to keep celebrating. Here in our neighborhood, one of the moms with the bomb shelter said, all the kids are invited to my house, come in costume. And we all came. And the parents dressed up too. And we played music. And we had fun. And it was all spontaneous. So she was like, everyone bring something. And we celebrated. And the music was loud. And the kids were having a great time. And in the middle of it all, the bomb sirens go off. And I have to say, it's hard not to get swept up in the kind of romantic atmosphere and in the real pride these days of being a Jew and of being an Israeli and, of being resilient and of going through this again.
I obviously get a lot of information from Israeli media, and there seemed to be quite a lot of euphoria, particularly when it came to the killing of Iran's brutal dictator, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who has now been replaced by his son, Mujtaba Khamenei. My sense was there was firstly a sense of clawing back some of that faith in security and defense that had gone missing for Israelis so tragically on October the 7th. But here we are now a couple of weeks in with it being a little less clear where things are going. Is that atmosphere still the same?
So first, I want to draw on why this atmosphere specifically now is so different than what we had from the beginning, right? Because as you very truly said, the first few days and the first few weeks after October 7th, that was total shock, total grief, unbelievable trauma. People were walking around and you can see with puffy eyes, with no sleep. It was a terrible time to be an Israeli. If we go to June, to the first round of the war with Iran, which was a huge success, right? But those first few days, people were a lot more afraid, right? It felt like the sky was falling down on us, right? And these rockets are terrifying, and it was all directed towards us. And it was the first time this was happening. We had this sense of national pride and unity, but it was a lot more fearful. And as you mentioned now, second time around, it didn't take a few days for us to realize we can go to the park as long as there's a nearby shelter and we can still go about our lives, right? It was a lot more scary. So this time, we're more confident. And so really the national pride and the sense of unity is something like we've never experienced before. To use the metaphor, no erection can last forever, right? This is not something that we can sustain. And so we are seeing things starting to move in public sentiment. But it is important that we first discuss, how Israelis are viewing this situation politically. So I want to bring in a study done by the Israeli Institute of Democracy. This is a really quick study they put together on March 2nd and March 3rd. So this is a few days into the war, relatively at the start, about a week ago. But this study goes to show we see that 82% of Israelis support this war. And when you break it down to different sectors, it's even more dramatic. 93% of Jewish Israelis support the war. 97% on the right, 93% in the center, 76% on the left. These are really dramatic numbers. And from the Arab sector, it's completely opposite. 26% support the war. And so you see how this really does translate, and also translates politically, into the fact that from the very beginning of this war, the opposition has said, unity, unity, unity. On the issue of Iran, we are united.
So it sounds to me that what people support is the reasons for the war, the potential threat that the war will remove. For how long do you think people are willing to pay the price of the war? I know in Israel that means usually no schools, there'll be another military call up, there are always economic costs. How long do you think that's going to last?
So look, we're on day 11 today. The last time around it was 12 days. Okay, we're starting to see cracks for sure, and we're starting to see Israelis asking questions. And this goes about our daily lives. This definitely goes about the economy. And are we going to go back to work? And how are we supposed to go back to work if our children still can't go to school? So there's public debate starting about, the school system. And there's public debate starting about jobs. And there's public debate, also discussing how long we can endure this emotionally, mentally, physically. And also, you have to remember, 30% of Israelis don't have access to a safe room or to a bomb shelter in their house, in their building. So they really have to rely on public shelters, and they have to leave the house. And it's a lot more complicated, and not all of them have a bomb shelter close to home. It directly correlates with the existing socioeconomical gaps in Israel, and it stresses them and it puts burden on them. Think about senior citizens. Think about people who, even if they have an accessible bomb shelter, going there 5 times a night, it's not possible for them. So we are starting to see fatigue, and that fatigue also has political implications, as people are also asking, what's the end game?
I often hear the military strategists talking about the difference between tactics and strategy, and I wonder if there isn't a lot of focus and euphoria from the tactics, and now when a lack of strategy is starting to become apparent, that might sort of change things. And so I wanted to read a quote from the Prime Minister, from Netanyahu, who has said, "We have achieved an historic victory which will stand for generations. We removed 2 existential threats, the threat of annihilation by nuclear weapons and the threat of annihilation by 20,000 ballistic missiles." When do you think he said that?
Probably back in June.
He said that back in June. And only a few days ago, he said, "We are in a fateful campaign for our very existence." So the decision to attack does seem to be off the back of a less than stellar attack back in June, which was sold as a historic existential victory. And a similar pitch has also been given about Hezbollah. When the ceasefire was reached after a year of war with Hezbollah, there was a promise that the southern part of Lebanon would be disarmed, and that just seems to be a bit of an illusion, really. At the same time, Hamas is still standing in Gaza, despite 2 years of war with them. And so my feeling is that there's a lot of support for justification for a war, but the results don't always live up to the justification. Do you think there are some realistic outcomes for this war?
Look, those concerns are shared by many Israelis, but we still see wide support for the war. And we also see quite dramatic wide support for Netanyahu's leadership in the war. It's also been reflected in the study done by IDI, right? Many Israelis who would not trust Netanyahu otherwise and who are, very much his political rivals, still trust what he's doing in this war. I would say to the people concerned about long-term strategy, I would say shwaya shwaya, slowly, slowly. Because if we do look in the long-term spectrum of what's happened over the past 2.5 years since October 7th, 2023, I remember those first few days, we felt the existential threat was so real. People were buying generators and people were stocking up on food, and people thought that, Hezbollah was going to do this horrific damage to us and we won't have electricity and we won't have hospitals and we will be, a country under horrific attack. And people were very afraid of Iran. And 2.5 years later, right, Nasrallah is out. Iran is taking some very, very big blows. The Assad regime in Syria has toppled. We're seeing a very different Middle East. And I think, most Israelis have the patience to endure some big promises when we're seeing that, in the overall game, we are moving towards more safety.
I think that in Australia, if our leaders went to a very big move that had such consequences, they wouldn't want to be hearing the same sales pitch 9 months later. Don't you think that hailing these achievements as historic and every time going, we've thwarted our existential threat, doesn't that hurt the credibility of leaders? Do people believe these grandiose statements? And how does that affect their perception of leaders who are obviously, to a certain extent, really misleading them?
So look, again, it's an issue of your political affiliation here in Israel, right? If you are more left-leaning here in Israel, you're more disillusioned by these bombastic statements of we are going to annihilate the existential threat. But I think Israelis on the center and obviously on the right, but also really the mainstream Israeli narrative, I have to say, is that specifically after October 7th, we take very seriously the threats made by our enemies. And when we have such a capable and such a strong enemy continuously saying, we want to annihilate you, we want to wipe you off the face of the earth, we want to, we don't want you here, that's scary. And people take that very seriously. And after October 7th, we don't have the privilege not to take these threats against us seriously. So for Israelis, they can view Netanyahu with cynicism and view his statements cynically. But in terms of reality, this war started with a very shocking reality change, which is Khamenei is gone. People are like, okay, I'm willing to I'll be cynical towards Netanyahu. I know his motives aren't necessarily my motives, but I'm happy with the result.
I was hearing in the early days already some rumours around the idea that an election would be called early so that the current government, its current leadership could ride the coattails of this attack, as you've mentioned, which garners such widespread support in Israel. But then I saw a poll commissioned by Ma'ariv, who were right-leaning, and they found that Likud only received a single extra seat in the polling for how election results would play out. And that was in the first week of the war. So that was before any of these cracks started showing. It looked to me that the overall political map didn't really change that much, even though the public was so euphoric.
No, absolutely. That's what all the polls are saying. So there have been many polls, and the picture is quite similar. The maps have not changed. Support for Netanyahu specifically as a leader and as a figure, and trust in Netanyahu as a leader and as a figure has gone up. But that hasn't changed the map of Israeli politics and the map of and the trajectory. And even if it has changed, maybe very in small margins, and we're going to see, right when this war is over, just like right when the war in June is over, we're going to go back to arguing about everything. And, I think the issue of Iran is so unique because on no other issue is the Israeli public as united as it is on the issue of Iran. And again, annihilating that very real, very tangible existential threat is something that we can all be behind and that we can all be proud of. We all agree that we should have a future here, okay? But when it comes to what that future is going to look like, that's where we are very, very much in disagreement. And the Israeli public that dislikes Netanyahu, that wants to vote him out, that wants a new government of change, can still back him on this because they're very much backed also by the security establishment and very much backed by the military and very much backed by, all the voices that we have grown to trust here in Israel. And so we can live with that duality. It's an interesting moment. Netanyahu might as well have 710 tattooed on his forehead, right? And he knows that. He knows that large parts of the Israeli public are never going to forgive him for what happened and for the, that dreadful, terrible day. So he knows he needs a big win, not just for a political gain, but for his legacy. And I think Israelis are willing to say, okay, Netanyahu, on this issue, go for it. On this issue, no opposition, which is, literally being said by the opposition leader. We'll finish what we need to finish in Iran, and we'll go back to arguing about how we proceed.
There was another thing that I saw that people were very united about, and that is support for Iranian protesters. But there seems to be lots of different reasons for that. So here in the West, and especially the Jewish diaspora communities, there was a sense of this solidarity that the Islamic Revolution, in the form of the Ayatollah dictatorship and the IRGC, is the source of evil and instability in the Middle East. So they're all for the protesters as being the front line against that regime. I think in Israel, people are hoping that Iranian protesters will do the work that the sort of IDF and the USA can't really finish militarily and then overthrow the government. But then I also noticed that there were detractors of the Israeli government who were making a direct comparison between the anti-democratic moves of the current government and this sort of slide into more religious and autocratic rule and the Iranian regime. And certainly the appointment of Khamenei's son, Mujtaba, has been the source of jokes that I've seen about Netanyahu and his attempts to insert his son into the political system.
So there's a show on Israeli TV. It's called Eretz Nehederet. And it's our big main satire show. It's been going on for decades. And it's kind of, for the Israeli left and center. Again, the right doesn't like this show, but they watch it. It's our meduat shevet. How would I say that? Israelis sit down to watch this show, and specifically in times of war and in times of elections and in times of high public interest in the news cycle. And they did an episode a few days ago, a special for the Iran war. And they know that everyone's sitting and watching. The entire nation is sitting and watching because, we're all stuck to our TVs, glued to the news. So we're all, taking this moment, and families are together, by the way. Many families have united. People who lack a bomb shelter go spend the time with their parents and vice versa. So they know that Israelis are sitting in front of the TV watching this. And they chose to finish with an ending monologue that has created ripples across social media and across Israeli public discourse, where they had, Khamenei, and he gave us a message from hell. And he was basically saying to us, you guys wait, I'm patient. And I see what happens in Iran, where religious fanaticism and religious fundamentalism took over and created tyranny. He basically warned that the same thing could happen in Israel. And that's created ripples. And that's definitely a sentiment here on the left and center.
Do you think that has resonated with people, even though they're supportive of Netanyahu?
No. If someone is supportive of Netanyahu, he got really pissed off at that monologue. And and all the ministers and all the Netanyahu defenders and supporters said, how dare you make the comparison? It caused quite a debate. But that just goes to show, right? As much as we are united against the need to defeat Iran, we are definitely not united about what happens afterwards.
My sense sometimes, though, is in Israel, you're on one side of the chess table and you've got a very strong game, but you don't always notice that there are lots of other moving parts that are really outside Israel's control. And I think certainly from the outside, there is this sense that even though, for example, the coordinated attack with USA is being sold in Israeli media as, historic, it's never happened, and that is true. but it's given as an indication of unbreakable relations. We're at the peak of relations with the USA, whereas I think externally there have been cracks across both sides of the aisle when it comes to Israel and US relations. And sometimes I wonder whether or not this was really the last chance to be able to have that sort of coordinated military attack, because moving forward, there would be a lot more controversy about such cooperation with Israel. So that's just one moving piece of the puzzle that is looking ahead. We haven't heard about Gaza in a couple of weeks now. The Board of Peace that Trump was trying to get up and running, those countries have now been dragged into this war, which is going to take their attention and their resources and also diplomatic capital. What happens there? That leaves a gaping hole for Hamas to grow back into. There's really kind of a lot else going on. How do not just political views, but also military views deal with all of these moving parts and see it still as being a victory for Israel?
Look, what's happening in the United States public opinion regarding Israel, both on the left and on the right, is something that I find very concerning, almost terrifying. Because, right now our safety and our security here and the fact that I can raise my girls here, I was going to say relatively quietly, but that's not really right for the past few days. But at least with the sense of somewhat safety and security, right? It's so dependent on our friends in America. And that's scary. It's scary to see how rapidly they are changing. But I will give you the other side of that. And I think maybe, the Israel that I want to live in is an Israel that cares more about what our neighbors here think about us and what they have to say about us, and not what, our friends across the Atlantic have to say. And when you look at what's happening here in our neighborhood, right? When you look at Jordan sending their fighter jets to take down Iranian drones, and Egypt opening its border and, helping to transport thousands of Israelis back into the country or out of the country through the Taba crossing. As you look at Lebanon, who have, outlawed the Revolutionary Guard and who have, this very, very new leadership that wants to talk to Israel, throwing out the word peace in the context of Lebanon, which is crazy. And if you look at Syria, where the Assad regime fell and we have this new moderate leader who wants to talk and be an ally with the ally that we are currently in war with, the United States. So things look and sound, and of course, the Emiratis and the Gulf states and the Saudis. I am of Arab Jewish descent. My family's from Syria. We can finally fantasize about, maybe going to visit Aleppo one day, where my grandparents were born. So America is changing, but the Middle East is also changing.
So pundits will often talk about the military only being able to go so far and the need to convert those military gains through other means. I'm amazed that you even mentioned the word peace. I felt like that is very far from people's vocabulary, or has been for a long time in Israel. So if we're talking about making peace, who are we making peace with? The Iran attack and now the additional front against Hezbollah is creating crossroads. Optimists will say, as you have, that there are pathways to peace that are made available by removing belligerent actors. The pessimists will probably point to previously failed Middle East interventions like the US in Iraq. I share your optimism of what Israel's future could be without the everyday threat of Hezbollah's missiles, not to mention Iran's nukes, which have overshadowed every step. And these threats have fed Israeli politics, especially over the last 2 decades. I think we all remember how much Iran was a speaking point of Netanyahu's. But this Israeli government has not made any signs that they would make moves towards peace once their existential threats stop being so real. And the Middle East does not have a reputation for miraculously rearranging itself in a good way. Experience shows that sometimes the opposite happens and that it's really a playground for bad faith actors. So my question is whether Israel is prepared to win the battle, but not the war. Because for this operation to be a success, it would have to look at the bigger picture. And that picture includes realistic objectives that are honestly communicated to a public. I would have thought that the word peace is so unpopular now that it would be political suicide. unlike the word victory. But even victory is losing currency when it was just used 9 months ago. And I've seen that when people are asked whether Israel won the 2-year war against Hamas, many Israelis of all political persuasions have said no. Things get stuck. And there's a term for it in Hebrew, as you know, when it comes to Gaza, habotza azati, which is really another way of saying that this could become a quagmire. You get stuck in it. So what often looks like a feat to begin with can quickly in the Middle East become a quagmire. It's uncomfortable to admit the limits of military power. Military power is necessary, but it's not sufficient for Israel's safe future. So if only Israel could be as bold on the leadership front as it is on the military front, I will share your optimism, Yuval, about what could happen next.
And I'll just stress that my optimism is very emotionally rooted and not necessarily rooted in rationale and in reality. I mean, I don't think we have another choice.
But one of the questions that I've had in the back of my head is how this could affect an Israeli election. It's known that people vote emotionally and not rationally. So if there was a grand leadership move that did stir people's emotions towards a more positive future, towards a safer future with Israel's neighbours, then potentially that could have an impact on people's voting preferences in the next election.
It really all comes down to what we're going to see, the outcome of this war, right? Right now we're in it, but it all comes down to how we're going to leave it and how we're going to exit this specific round. And Netanyahu knows that. And so again, this is where his political interest of being reelected really does meet the public interest of doing something real in Iran. And I think none of us live in an illusion anymore. We all want to see changes in reality.
On that note, we'll leave this conversation. Thank you for joining this special episode of Politica, Israeli Politics Explained. We will be joining you again, explaining Israeli politics and the upcoming election at a diaspora volume. But for now, Yuval, stay safe. And for everybody else, keep the volume down.